Metallica had a lot to prove with Death Magnetic, the studio album that would follow up Saint Anger. Saint Anger was commercially successful, however, whenever it came to the critics, it's kind of one that's divided right down the middle line, but swaying a lot more towards the negative. This is one thing where, on this channel at least, coverkillernation lore, Saint Anger is considered as putrid and awful, though I re-examined it last Friday, and well, compared to the other shit that's come out in the past 10 years, Saint Anger's actually aged pretty well. But Death Magnetic still had a huge hurdle that Metallica had to leap over. Once again, it seems like that this is something that they really have had to do, even without really needing to do it. If this were any other band, it wouldn't have been such a large hurdle, but since it was Metallica, since it's the biggest metal band on Earth, this is definitely one that needed to happen. Now, for one, this was also a period of change. Instead of Bob Rock being behind the helm at the producer's booth, it's going to be somebody completely different. They instead went with Rick Rubin, which ended a, well, roughly 5-album-long handshaking, partnering with Bob Rock, in which Bob Rock actually helped with the bass tracking of Saint Anger. Now that duty is now being handled by Robert Trujillo, of course, considering Jason Newsted had left prior to the Saint Anger recordings. So after this whole idea, Rick Rubin had some fresh ones, and definitely had some plans for this album. However, the band themselves kind of had to concoct the idea. They had to concoct the concept. Now, don't look too far into that last sentence. This is not a concept album by any stretch of the imagination. However, the title of the album is based around the concept of death. And it's been reported that Kirk Hammett at one point in time brought in a photograph of Lane Staley to the studio, which kind of messed with James' psyche a little bit. He wondered a lot of different things about why Staley did and went down the path that he did, considering he had such musical talent, but yet died so young. Death Magnetic is a name that just sort of stuck, and it actually is in the song My Apocalypse. Now, there's a radical departure in some ways from this album, between this album and Saint Anger. The song lengths are still the same, only actually Death Magnetics are just a wee bit longer, so right off the bat, if you're a Metallica fan and you remember Saint Anger, and Saint Anger is actually the freshest thing in your mind, this is something that's concerning to you. Because you remember Saint Anger and how the songs that were lengthy, which there were a number of them, seemed to really musically go nowhere. There didn't seem to be a lot of dynamic to them. And of course, if that's the last thing that's fresh in your mind, your immediate thought process is that this is going to be an album that's much of the same, only it's going to be even longer, which is going to mean it's going to be even more painful to listen to. Well, the addition of Rubin and a stylistic directional shift were probably two things that gave Metallica fans a little bit of solace, because they kind of wanted to return a little bit more to the roots of the machine. Kind of want to go back to the 1980s and the thrash metal ideology, only giving it a little bit of an updated twist. Now, remember your history, kids. This is right around the time whenever the thrash revival was in full swing. So, instead of Metallica being the glorified trendsetters, now Metallica almost seemed like they were glorified trend followers. With Saint Anger, they did something different, and with this, they wanted to go back to the hard days, the edge, and the thrash. Really just depends on your perspective. Stylistically, I'd probably put this album between And Justice for All and the Black Album. Now, I know I've said that before, but it bears repeating only because of how it sounds. Stylistically, there are some simpler moments, some moments where it's a little bit more stripped down, which is the reason why it leans a little bit more toward the Black Album. However, whenever I look at it compositionally, whenever I look at it through the songwriting eyes, and whenever I listen to these tracks again, a number of years after the last time I've listened to this album, I still have the same conclusion drawn, that this is perfectly bred for right after And Justice for All. The songwriting, it just seems like, is where And Justice for All was kind of going to lead to. Let's say, for example, instead of them going into the studio with Bob Rock and recording the Black Album, they went in the studio with some other asshole and recorded an album. This is the album I think that they would record, or at least something that sounds a little bit like this. Not to say that And Justice for All was going to be the be-all, end-all extension of where their career goes, or where it went, should I say, to use a past word. It just seemed as though this is, these were ideas, or these were concepts, these were songwriting little facets that they were kind of primed to examine once again, and actually got the opportunity to with Death Magnetic. Now, a lot of you probably remember The Day That Never Comes. You probably remember that whenever that song was announced, whenever it was released, much like Saint Anger, it was released, and there was a ton of interest and acclaim and this and that. Okay, maybe not acclaim, not for Saint Anger, but for The Day That Never Comes, there was. This was definitely where that kind of ideology, that this frame of time, this frame of reference, really seemed to come out of all of this, because it had the feel of the song One a little bit, only it was a little bit more stripped down, it was a little bit more black albumed, so to speak, and The Day That Never Comes is a song that you don't hear that often on the radio or anything like that anymore, but at the time frame, it was kind of unavoidable, and it was one of those songs where, unlike Saint Anger, the first single off of that album, people wanted to hear this one. This wasn't one that people wanted to kind of just disappear into oblivion. Let's not even talk about I Disappear. Now, there's also an Unforgiven on this record. The Unforgiven 3. It's, 2 wasn't enough, so they needed to make this a trio, a trilogy. And, once again, this is another song that's actually fairly underrated. It's pretty decent. I like this. In fact, there's a lot of material on this album that I find myself liking. Once again, I have to criticize the length a little bit, but at least now with the time frame, they're doing a lot more with it. So instead of this being a lot of dead space, a lot of empty air, where they're just kind of repeating the same riff over and over again in a jam session that perpetually goes nowhere, instead with these songs, there's definitely a lot more in the way of dynamic. There's a lot more in the way of development. This is something that sounds as though it's been thought out, as opposed to it was something that was conceived in a very limited time frame. So because of that, there's a little bit higher expectation, and the expectation's actually been semi-quenched. It's just that it's still stylistically just a little too soft as far as everything else is concerned. It's something that doesn't quite register the same, or evoke the same level of accolade and the same level of acclaim as the albums from the 1980s. Now, there's also a supposed problem with the fact that everything seemed way too loud on this album. Now, I listened to this album, the last time I listened to this album was a couple years ago, and then I just listened to it a couple times within the past week, and yeah, it's loud, don't get me wrong, but the loudness war, excuse, as people say, it's pretty accurate. The loudness war is something that was going on, and probably still is sort of going on, where people are just trying to make the loudest album possible because of all this newfound digital technology and all this fun production shit. Well, this album definitely was a part of it, and yeah, it definitely has a very loud register to it. But at this point in time, as far as the aging process is concerned, this is something that we've all grown to be kind of used to, so it doesn't really hold a candle anymore. But at the time, it definitely was something that sparked a little bit of debate and a little bit of chatter in both directions whenever the album was released. Now, let's talk about overall score, let's talk about overall value, and let's talk about how this album has indeed aged in a couple of years. It's been 6 years since its release. Well, the one thing I'll say is that, very similar to the first review that I did of this album, anything's going to be better than Saint Anger, and Death Magnetic definitely fulfilled that prophecy very nicely. Imagine it, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm jumping ahead, if the next thing that you heard after Saint Anger had been Lulu. Damn, we're going to get to that next. Now, as far as the overall score is concerned, this would definitely be one that'd be sort of middle of the road to, above average. So I would probably give it, if I were scoring it on my traditional scale, probably a 7.75 to an 8. This is one that is very tolerable. It's not too bad, but at the same time, as I stated earlier, it doesn't really harness that same, those same feelings. It doesn't evoke that same acclaim as some of the albums that perhaps they were trying to, update a little bit with this sound. As far as 6 years worth of age is concerned, once again, this is an album that gets a little bit better as the time goes on. And I think the principal reason why it was kind of, at the moon and then kind of dropped off so fast is because people would listen to this album directly after, with Saint Anger being the last thing in their mind, and of course it's going to sound amazing. But then they go back and revisit some of the old classics and things like that, kind of do a Metallica marathon or something like that, and realize that, it's just kind of a middle-of-the-road album. It's not really all that great. However, with Lulu coming directly after this, the stock definitely rose a little bit, I'm sure, but I think in Metallica lore, this is always going to be seen as kind of a middle to the lower road album for them. It's going to be one that's going to be appreciated, however, it's not necessarily going to be treasured by many. I say by many because I'm sure there are a number of people out there, and all of them are going to watch this video, And they're going to comment about how Death Magnetic is their favorite album. And I appreciate that. And I value your opinion. So definitely don't skirt out on those, making those comments just because I called you out. Please, just do it anyway. I'm doing it again. I'm trying to delay the inevitable. Lulu. That's next. Oh, Beyond Magnetic. I could talk about that. I might. So, yeah. We'll see.